This is my true story. I raised my son with love, food, and shelter, hoping he would carry my name with pride. But instead, he looked at me with anger and told me I was nothing but a curse on his family. Those words broke me in ways I cannot explain, but I refused to let silence bury my pain. I chose to stand tall and hand over the truth of his cruelty. Before I share what I did next, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so these stories reach more people. I spent my younger years working day and night just to build a life for my son. My body carried the weight of heavy labor, my hands cracked, and my back bent under endless loads. I did not care about my own comfort, because all I wanted was to give my boy the chance I never had. I missed meals so he could eat a full plate. I wore old shoes so he could walk to school in strong ones. Every sacrifice I made was not for me, but for him, because I believed a father's worth was measured in what he gave his child. There were nights when I worked until the stars faded and the sun came back again. My legs ached and my eyes barely stayed open, but my heart was full because I knew it was for my son's future. I put every coin I earned into his books, his clothes, and his education. While others saved money for their own pleasures, I saved mine for his tomorrow. I believed love was shown not in words, but in the sweat of my labor. And I gave all of mine for him, thinking one day he would look back and call me a father he was proud of. I lived with hunger many times, watching him eat while my stomach remained empty. I told myself it was worth it, because the smile on his face mattered more than my pain. I wore torn shirts until the fabric barely held together, while he wore new ones I bought with my hard work. I told myself dignity was not in clothes, but in knowing I had given my child the best I could. I thought a day would come when he would see my sacrifices and thank me, not with riches, but with respect and care. Every coin I held went to his schooling. I denied myself the warmth of a good bed so he could sleep in comfort. I denied myself rest so he could have a better start. While others spent time in laughter, I spent mine in silence, working hard to make sure he would never face the same struggles I faced as a boy. My body aged faster because of the heavy work, but I believed it was worth it. Every wrinkle on my face was a story of the sacrifices I made for him. When people laughed at me for living poor while working so hard, I never felt shame. I told them my wealth was not in money, but in my son's future. I told myself that my son would rise higher because of what I gave up. I carried hope like a shield against every insult. My love for him blinded me to the pain of my own hunger, my own tiredness, and my own loneliness. I did not care for myself, only for the boy I raised with every drop of my strength. I believed with all my heart that sacrifice would bring gratitude. I thought he would grow up, look at me, and see not a poor man, but a father who gave him everything. I thought he would understand that my worn-out body was proof of my love. I thought his respect for me would grow as he grew older. I thought the world would see me through his success, and I thought my name would shine brighter through him. All of my faith was in him, all of my hope was in him, and all of my sacrifices were for him. At first, I told myself his sharp words were only from youth, from the impatience of a young man who did not yet understand life. But soon, his tone grew colder, his replies shorter, and his eyes no longer carried the warmth of a son. He began to speak to me, not with care, but with irritation, as if my very presence disturbed his peace. Every time I offered advice, he brushed it aside, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with silence, but never with respect. What once felt like a bond of love slowly turned into a wall of distance. When I reminded him of traditions that kept our family strong, he only mocked them. The songs I used to sing, he called old. The prayers I whispered, he said were useless. The stories of our ancestors that I carried in my heart, he said, were nothing but foolish tales. I felt like a stranger in my own home, as if the values I lived by had no place in his world. He laughed when I tried to guide him, and the sound of that laughter cut deeper than any insult. It told me my voice no longer mattered. The more I tried to bring him close, the more he pushed me away. I asked him to sit with me, but he left the room. I asked him to share a meal, but he rolled his eyes and said he was busy. The boy I once carried on my shoulders now looked at me as if I were a burden too heavy to bear. It hurt me in silence, but I kept waiting for him to remember the love I had poured into his life. I told myself patience would heal the distance. His disrespect grew, not just in private, but in front of others. He raised his voice at me before neighbors. He dismissed my words before relatives. He looked at me as though I was less than him, forgetting that every step he took was built upon the sacrifices of my own. I stayed quiet, hoping he would realize the shame he was bringing upon himself. But his pride only grew larger, while my heart grew smaller with each passing day. I noticed how he looked at my aging body with disdain. When I struggled to lift things, he smirked instead of helping. When I coughed in the night, he complained about the noise. When I moved slowly, he called me useless. These were not the eyes of a son, but of someone who saw his father as nothing more than a shadow. The love that once tied us seemed to vanish, replaced by annoyance and coldness. I waited, prayed, and hoped for change, but it never came. Instead of drawing closer as he matured, he drifted further away. His friends became his world, his work became his pride, and I was left as an afterthought. He never asked how I was, never cared if I had eaten, never wondered if I was in pain. I became invisible to him, though I had once been the center of his universe. That was the early sign, the small cracks in the bond between father and son. And though I tried to ignore them, those cracks were only the beginning of a deeper wound that would tear me apart. The day came when his disrespect turned into something sharper, something I could not forget. It started like many other days, with him ignoring my presence and dismissing my words. I tried to guide him about a small matter in the house, something simple, but he grew restless and angry. His voice rose higher and higher until the air itself felt heavy. Then he shouted the words that broke me more than any pain I had ever felt in my life. He looked me in the eye and said, "You're a curse on this family." In that moment, the world went silent. My ears heard the words, but my heart refused to believe them. A curse? After all the years of sacrifice? After all the nights I stayed hungry so he could eat? After all the days I worked with tired hands so he could live a better life? He did not just reject my guidance, he rejected my very existence, my life, my love, my years, all reduced to a single word: curse. It was as if my soul had been struck with a blade. The words cut deeper than any wound on the body. I had felt pain before from hard labor, from illness, from accidents, but nothing compared to the sting of those words. They dug into my chest and stayed there, echoing again and again in my mind. "You're a curse." It was not just anger, it was rejection of me as a father, as a man, as a human being. He made me feel like my life had no worth, as though I should never have existed at all. I stood frozen, unable to speak back. My lips trembled, but no words came. I had spent a lifetime raising him, and in one breath, he erased everything I had done. My silence was not weakness, it was heartbreak. I wanted to shout, to remind him of the sacrifices, to tell him how wrong he was, but my heart was too heavy and my throat too dry. The insult became a chain around my soul, locking me in grief. After he spoke, he walked away as if nothing had happened, as if he had not destroyed his own father with a single sentence. He went on with his day, while I sat in the corner, staring at the ground, feeling smaller than ever before. I thought of his childhood, of the times he clung to me for comfort, of the times he said he loved me. All those memories clashed with his cruel words, and I could no longer recognize the boy I had raised. It felt like my son had died, and in his place stood a stranger. The silence of the house after his outburst was louder than any noise. My chest ached, my hands trembled, and my eyes filled with tears I refused to let fall. To cry would mean his words had destroyed me completely. I clenched my fists and swallowed my pain, but inside, anger began to burn. If he could reduce my entire life to a curse, then he would one day face the truth of what he had done. My heart was broken, but deep within, a fire had been lit. The cruelty of my son was not only in the words he shouted at me. Words alone could wound my heart. but his hands and his anger left wounds that marked my body. He had a temper that grew darker as the days went by, and sometimes that temper turned into actions that no father should ever suffer from his own child. He would push me aside when I moved too slowly, shove me when he thought I was in his way, and sometimes raise his hand against me when anger controlled him. Every strike told me that respect was gone. At first, I tried to excuse his behavior. I told myself he was stressed, that he was carrying the burden of life, that maybe he did not mean to harm me the way he did. But excuses could not hide the truth. The truth was on my skin, where bruises appeared, blue and purple, reminders of his rage. They did not heal as quickly as when I was young, and each mark stayed longer, becoming a shadow of pain. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not just an old man, but a father carrying shame in silence. I wore long sleeves even in warm weather. I told neighbors I felt cold, but it was not the cold of the air. It was the cold of fear and humiliation. I hid the bruises because I did not want others to see how far my life had fallen. I once stood tall as a father who provided, who was respected, but now I hid like a man who had no voice. Covering the marks gave me a sense of protection, but deep inside, I knew I was only protecting him, not myself. I was shielding his cruelty from the eyes of the world. Each bruise carried a story. One on my arm came from when I tried to stop him from shouting at his children. Another on my back came from when he shoved me against the wall for speaking too slowly. The mark on my leg came from being kicked when I did not move fast enough. They were not accidents. They were proof of a son's anger turning into violence. But still, I stayed quiet, because I could not believe that my own child, the boy I raised with love, had become the man who hurt me. The pain of the bruises was not only physical, it was emotional, and that pain was far heavier. I sat alone at night, touching the sore spots on my skin, wondering how I reached this point in life. How could a father end up bruised and broken in the house he once built with his own hands? I asked myself what mistake I had made to deserve this, but no answer ever came. Silence filled the room, and the only sound was the beating of my heart, slower and weaker with every new scar. But somewhere in that silence, a thought began to grow. Bruises could be hidden with clothes, but they could not be hidden forever. One day, they would have to be seen. One day, the truth would have to be told. I realized I could not go on like this, living behind long sleeves and excuses. My son thought he had silenced me with fear, but I began to understand that my silence only gave him more power. The bruises were painful, yes, but they were also evidence. And evidence, once revealed, could bring justice. The day finally came when I could no longer carry the weight of silence. Every morning I looked in the mirror and saw the fading bruises, but I also saw the man I once was. I was not always this weak, not always this quiet. I remembered the strong father who worked under the sun, who built a roof with his bare hands, who stood proud in his community. That man still lived inside me, and he began to whisper that silence was not strength. Silence was fear, and fear would only feed my son's cruelty. I realized that if I stayed quiet, the cycle would never end. My son would continue to hurt me, and one day, perhaps, his anger would spread even further. He might turn the same cruelty on his wife or his children, teaching them that violence was the way to handle pain. That thought broke me even more than my own suffering. I could not let my grandchildren grow up believing that hurting others was normal. If I stayed silent, I would not only fail myself, I would fail them too. That was the moment I decided something had to change. At first, the idea of speaking out frightened me. I had lived my life protecting my family, even when it hurt me. To expose my son meant destroying the image of the man people thought he was. He walked in the community with pride, smiling at neighbors, pretending to be a good son. If I revealed the truth, I knew people would look at him differently. But then I asked myself, why should I protect a man who did not protect me? Why should I guard his name while my own body carried the marks of his shame? So I began to prepare. I did not shout. I did not argue. I simply gathered proof. I kept a small notebook hidden in my drawer where I wrote every detail of what he had done. the times, the dates, the way it happened. I noted down every bruise, every push, every shove. I took photos of my arms and my back when the bruises were fresh, proof that could not be denied. Each note and each picture became a piece of the truth that no words could twist. I also spoke quietly to a trusted neighbor, someone who had seen me limping one day. At first, I wanted to deny it, to say I had slipped, but something inside told me I had to stop lying. I told her the truth, and she promised to stand by me if ever I needed her voice. It gave me strength to know that I was not completely alone. For the first time in many years, I felt a small light in the darkness. I was building something greater than silence. I was building courage. The decision was no longer just about me. It was about justice, about dignity, about showing the world that cruelty could not be hidden behind closed doors forever. I knew the risk. I knew my son would hate me, that the bond of father and child might break completely. But I also knew that the bond had already been shattered by his hands, not mine. I could not save that bond, but I could save my dignity. I could save my truth. And so, with every note written, with every picture taken, I prepared myself for the day I would walk into the light and reveal everything. The morning I walked into the police station, my legs trembled under me, but my heart held steady. I had carried the weight of silence for too long, and now the time had come to put it down. I wore my old shirt, the one that covered the scars and bruises, but under the cloth I carried proof. In my small bag, I held the notebook, the photographs, and the memories that had turned into evidence. Every step toward the station felt heavy, but each one also felt like freedom calling me closer. The station doors opened, and the smell of dust and paper filled the air. Inside, I saw officers at their desks, busy with their work, but I felt their eyes glance toward me. For a moment, I almost turned back. I thought of my son's face, the fury in his eyes when he would learn what I had done. But then I thought of my grandchildren, of the nights I spent hiding pain, of the words, "You're a curse on this family." Those words gave me strength. They reminded me that I had already been thrown out of love. There was nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. I walked up to the desk, my voice low but clear. The officer looked up, and I placed my bag on the table. My hand shook as I opened it and showed him the notebook. Page by page, I explained what each note meant, what each date carried, what each bruise told. I showed him the photographs, the marks across my skin, proof that could not be denied. For years I had carried my pain in silence, but now I was placing it in front of the law, letting it breathe under the weight of truth. The officer did not rush me. He listened, his pen moving slowly across the paper as he wrote down my words. His face grew serious with each picture, each page. I could see that he understood. That gave me the strength to keep going. I told him about the threats, the shoves, the nights I could not sleep. I told him how my son called me a curse, how he made me feel smaller than the man I once was. I spoke softly, but inside I was shouting. Every word was my fight for dignity. Another officer joined, listening closely, asking questions gently. They asked if anyone else knew, and I gave the name of my neighbor. They asked how long it had been happening, and I told them the truth. It had been years. As I spoke, I felt my chest lighten. It was as if the burden I had carried alone had been lifted and placed on stronger shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel weak. I felt seen. I felt heard. When I finished, I placed the last photograph on the table. The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. The officer nodded, closing the file, and said they would take immediate action. His words were calm, but to me they sounded like thunder. They were not just promises, they were the beginning of justice. I walked out of the station still trembling, but my heart was no longer heavy. I had handed them the cruelty. I had chosen truth over fear. I had taken my first real step toward freedom. The day the police came back to me, I knew the truth was no longer just mine to hold. They called me into a quiet room at the station and asked me to show everything again. This time, I pulled back my sleeve, and the dark bruises shone under the dim light. My arms told a story I could no longer hide. I stood still as they examined each mark, each scar, each reminder of my son's cruelty. For so long, I had hidden them with fabric and silence. But now, silence was over. My body spoke louder than my words. They asked me to lift my shirt, and I did so with slow hands. The officers looked carefully at the deep purple marks across my ribs, the older scars fading into pale lines, the fresh wounds still tender. I saw their faces harden, their pens stop moving for a moment. They did not need me to explain further. The evidence was written on my skin, carved by pain and betrayal. Each mark was a truth my son could not erase. Each bruise was a testimony of nights filled with fear and days swallowed by shame. I placed the photographs on the table one by one, matching them with the bruises they now saw in front of them. Each photo was a memory I wished I never had, but I kept them to make sure I would never be called a liar. I pointed to the dates in my notebook, showing them how the injuries lined up with the days of anger. I spoke with steady words, but inside I felt a storm breaking free. For years, I had been trapped in silence, but now my pain had become undeniable truth. The officers leaned closer, asking about the threats, the words that cut deeper than fists. I told them about the nights when my son's voice filled the house with hate, calling me a curse, saying I did not belong, telling me I had no worth. They listened without interruption. I saw in their eyes that they understood this was not only about bruises on the skin. It was about bruises on the soul, scars carved into the heart of a father who gave everything and received cruelty in return. As I finished, the room was silent again. Papers and photographs covered the table. My arms were bare, my truth laid open. One of the officers spoke quietly, promising that no man should endure this, promising that justice would be done. Their words carried weight. It was no longer a private pain locked inside my chest. It was now a case, a matter of law, a truth backed by evidence and authority. For the first time, I felt my suffering had power. I walked out of that room with my sleeves still rolled up, the marks still visible. I no longer cared if the world saw. For years, I covered them with shame. But today, they were not symbols of weakness. They were proof of strength. They were the reason justice would come. I had shown every wound, every scar, every bruise. And in doing so, I had shown the world that truth can never stay hidden forever. The day justice arrived, the air outside was heavy with silence. Neighbors stood by their doors. Children whispered, and every eye seemed to watch as the police car rolled up to my son's house. I stood on the porch, my hands folded, my heart steady. For years, I had trembled in fear, but now it was his turn to tremble. The officers stepped out, their uniforms sharp, their eyes firm, their steps strong. They carried my truth in their files, my pain in their records, and my hope in their duty. Justice had finally come knocking. When the door opened, my son stood tall, still arrogant, still proud, as if no force could ever touch him. He looked at the officers with a smirk, the same smirk he once used to belittle me, to remind me I was powerless in his world. But today, he was not the one in control. The police spoke firmly, reading his name, showing the papers, stating the charges. His smile faded slowly, confusion slipping into fear. For the first time, he saw that his actions had consequences. His arrogance began to melt. The officers asked him to step forward. He tried to argue, to deny, to twist the story into lies, but the evidence was stacked against him. They had my photos, my written words, the scars still fresh on my body. They had my voice, steady and clear, telling the truth he thought would never be told. Every word I had spoken became a chain around him, binding him tighter than any rope. The police did not raise their voices. They did not need to. The truth was stronger than anger. Then, the moment came. The silver handcuffs glistened in the light as they snapped shut around his wrists. The sound echoed in the street like a final judgment. My son, who once raised his hand to strike me, now stood with his hands bound by law. His eyes darted around, desperate, searching for support, but the neighbors only watched in silence. Some whispered, some shook their heads, but none stepped forward to defend him. The proud man who called me a curse was now exposed before the world. I stood still, not gloating, not smiling, but calm. My silence was louder than his shouts. He yelled, he denied, he called it a mistake, but the flashing lights of the police car drowned his words. Every insult he had ever thrown at me seemed to return to him now. Every bruise he left on my skin became a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The same neighbors who once ignored my pain now saw the truth. Respect returned to me, not through pity, but through justice. As the car door closed behind him, I felt a release I had never known. The years of carrying his cruelty in silence ended in that single moment. I no longer had to hide my arms or my shame. The street had seen, the police had acted, and the world now knew who the real curse was. Justice did not come with shouting or anger. It came with quiet strength, with truth spoken at the right time, with proof that could not be denied. My dignity, once buried under fear, now stood tall again. After the police took him away, the air in the house felt different. Silence filled the rooms where once there had been shouting. The walls seemed to breathe again. For years, I had lived in fear, carrying my pain quietly. Now, there was peace. It was not loud peace, but quiet, deep peace that settled in my bones. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the places where we had lived together, where he had turned love into cruelty. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Neighbors spoke softly when they saw me. Some nodded with respect, some looked at me with sorrow, and others simply stood in silence. My children and grandchildren came to visit more often. They no longer avoided me. They wanted to hear my side of the story. They wanted to know why I had made the choice to stand before the police. They wanted to understand how a father could turn his own pain into proof, how silence could turn into justice. I answered them with calm words and steady eyes. My home became quieter. Without his yelling, without the insults, without the slamming of doors, the air felt softer. I could rest without fear. I could sleep without waking to anger. I kept my daily routine, but now it carried a different meaning. Each meal I prepared, each chair I sat in, each step I took through the house became a symbol of my regained dignity. I knew my life had changed forever. Not because of revenge alone, but because truth had been spoken. His arrest became the talk of the neighborhood. Some spoke in whispers of shame, some in surprise, and some in quiet relief. The man who had said I was a curse now carried the curse of his own actions. His name was spoken differently now, not with pride, but with caution and pity. The story of what had happened spread quietly, but it spread. My truth had become part of their truth. They now knew that respect is not given lightly, and that cruelty has a cost. The police called me later to confirm the case. They told me the charges were being processed. They said my evidence was strong. I felt no joy in hearing this. I felt a quiet sense of closure. Justice was no longer just a word, it had become an action. I realized that my silence had been my prison, and my speaking had been my release. My dignity was returned, not through anger or revenge, but through the proof of my truth. My body still carried the marks of his cruelty, but my heart was lighter. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change in myself. I walked with steadier steps. I spoke with softer but firmer words. I no longer felt small. My story became a quiet lesson to others who suffered in silence. Friends told me my courage had inspired them. They said they had learned that no one should carry cruelty alone. I began to speak more openly about what had happened, not to seek pity, but to remind others that there is power in truth. That silence protects cruelty, but speaking ends it. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The house stayed calm. I began to find joy again in small things: morning tea on the porch, the laughter of grandchildren, quiet evenings by myself. The wound in my heart healed slowly, but it healed. I never asked for apologies. I never wished harm on him. I wanted only peace, respect, and truth. The law had given me that. It had turned my pain into a quiet victory. I had spoken, I had shown the world, and justice had been done. I often think about what happened. I do not hate him, but I do not forgive without truth. My silence once protected him. Now my voice protects others. the police, the neighbors, my family, they all saw the truth that day. I learned that courage is not always loud. It is often quiet. It is the courage to stand and speak when it feels impossible. My life after that day was different. I walked with dignity, knowing that I had reclaimed something priceless. Justice had become my peace. My home is filled with calm now. I no longer live in fear. I carry no burden of silence. My children respect me, not because I was their father, but because I chose to stand. They understand that respect must be earned and cruelty must be faced. My story has become theirs now. They speak of it quietly, as a lesson for life. The name of my son is no longer powerful in my house. His words have lost their sting. The truth has replaced them, and that truth has given me my peace. Now I look back and see that justice was never about punishment alone. It was about truth. It was about breaking the silence. It was about showing that no one, not even a father's own child, has the right to destroy another's dignity. I stand before others now, not to speak of revenge, but to speak of justice. My voice is steady. My heart is calm. My wounds remind me of the pain, but my peace reminds me of the power of truth. The aftermath was not loud. It was quiet. But in that quiet was a lesson I hope others will carry. Cruelty cannot survive truth. Silence cannot protect the guilty, and respect is the foundation of every family. I have learned these lessons deeply. My son said I was a curse. I stood before the police and handed them his cruelty. The world listened, justice was served, and my peace was restored. Now I sit as an old man, thinking quietly about what happened. My life was filled with love, work, and sacrifice. I gave everything for my family, yet the cruelty of one word changed my world. You are a curse on this family. Those words stayed in my heart like stones. They were heavier than any blow. They carried the weight of years of pain. I could not ignore them. I could not return to silence. I knew I had to act. In my years, I learned many things about life. I learned that love is patient, but patience can run out. I learned that respect is not given automatically. It must be earned. And when respect is lost, silence will not bring it back. I learned that cruelty cannot be hidden forever. It will find its way into the open. I learned that truth has a power that nothing else can match. These lessons became my guide. They gave me strength. They gave me reason to stand before the police and show the proof of what had been done. As I handed them the evidence, I felt many emotions. There was sorrow for what had been lost. There was pain for the wounds carried silently. But there was also calmness. I was no longer trapped in fear. My voice had been heard. My truth had been shown. Justice had been done. I understood then that courage is not loud. It is quiet, steady, and deeply personal. It is found in the decision to stand for truth when all seems lost. That day, I found my courage. I think often about my son. I do not wish to hate him. Hate is heavy. I wish for him to understand. I wish for him to see what words and actions can do to a heart. I wish for him to learn that respect cannot be demanded with power. It must be given with love. I wish he could see that his cruelty became his own curse, that the insults, the anger, the violence, all of it, broke not only me, but himself. My silence protected him for years. My voice freed us both. My grandchildren ask me about that day. They ask why I went to the police. I tell them simply, because truth must be shown, because cruelty must not live in silence. I tell them that respect is not optional, that dignity is not given away without a fight. I tell them that life teaches us through pain, that we must listen, that we must stand. I hope they understand. I hope they carry this lesson with them, that they will not let silence protect cruelty, and that they will stand for truth. I have learned that age brings wisdom, but it also brings patience. My years have taught me the value of quiet strength. I do not shout my story. I do not demand others listen, but I tell it so they may understand, so they may know that there is power in speaking out. that there is dignity in standing for what is right. My voice was once silent. Now it is steady. Now it is free. I tell my story for those who cannot. I tell it so that truth will not be hidden. Looking back, I see that my greatest victory was not in the punishment of my son. My greatest victory was in reclaiming my dignity. It was in showing that a father, even when betrayed, still has power. It was in teaching my family that silence is not strength. That truth is. The police, my neighbors, my family, they all saw it that day. I stood before them, an old man with bruises, and I showed them the truth. It was my final act of love for my family. I will not lie. The road was painful. The days after were heavy with doubt and sorrow. But I do not regret my choice. For in choosing to stand, I gave myself peace. I gave my family the lesson of courage. I gave my grandchildren a truth they must carry. I learned that justice is not a loud cry. It is a steady, quiet action. It is the courage to speak when silence is easier. That is my truth. That is my peace. Now I live quietly, with my memories and my lessons. I no longer fear the shadow of cruelty. I have faced it. I have shown it. My wounds heal slowly, but my heart is strong. My story is not just mine. It belongs to anyone who has suffered in silence. I tell it for them. I tell it so they will know they are not alone, that they have the right to stand, that truth will always carry weight, that dignity must be fought for. My last reflection is this: life gives us moments that change us forever. For me, it was the day he called me a curse. It was the day I stood before the police. It was the day I chose truth over silence. That day taught me more than years of living. It taught me that respect is earned, that silence protects cruelty, that truth restores dignity, that a father's love can turn pain into justice, that a curse spoken aloud can be undone by courage. Now, I end my story with this thought. I lived long enough to see cruelty fall before truth. I lived long enough to reclaim my dignity. I lived long enough to show my family that respect is never given freely, but it can always be demanded with truth. My son said I was a curse on this family. I stood before the police and handed them his cruelty. The world listened. Justice was done. And I found my peace.